So I can start off. So as you know, my name's Madeline, and I'm a fourth year student at UVic. I'm in biology and psychology, and I ended up in elect her sort of through friends and through interest. And as I mentioned in some of the earlier emails, elect her, our goal is really to uplift young women and people from marginalized genders to reach to be in positions of leadership and to gain the confidence to sort of put themselves out there and follow sort of what their passions are. And so we started this speaker series to sort of share the stories of women who are in those positions and how they got there and what their advice would be for the younger generation. And so that was how sort of led towards you and your work. And so before we get going, we just start with a territorial acknowledgement. We shall acknowledge with respect that we live upon the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanich people's territory, and that their vital relationships with the land continue to this day. I know you're probably on different territory because obviously I'm in Victoria, but that's sort of for our end. And so again, I'd like to thank you for coming to talk to us. And if you'd like, you could just give yourself a little bit of an introduction for those who'll be listening in the future.
Sure. So my name is Tiana. My pronouns are she and her, and I started Sexual Exploitation Education after working in the field for a few years and seeing a gap in services. And it was quite a risk actually to go down this route, but I felt like it was necessary. And so that's kind of what I'm doing now. And I'm very happy to be a part of this series and to have come in contact with you and a lecture. I think it's great.
And how long ago was it that you founded Sexual Exploitation?
It was just last year, actually. It was last year, July. Yeah.
Oh, wow. So
it's only been a year. A lot's happened in that year. But I've been working in the field for about maybe, oh my gosh, it's been more than that, about 7 years now. So
okay. And how did you first sort of get into the community work, social justice sort of side, and then obviously how did that translate into your work now?
Yeah, I think just my personality type, I've always had a strong sense of justice, and that's just always been a part of me. And the other aspect is that I grew up in a family that was Baha'i, and the Baha'i faith really emphasizes community service and community work. And so from a very young age, I was volunteering in the community and trying to make an impact. And so I think it just felt natural for me that whatever I did in my career, the purpose would be to give back to the community. I went into psychology and counseling for my degree, and not really sure what I was going to do with that, but I was hoping to do something that was more on the education side of things. So.
And I mean, it seems to have worked out, so that's good. Did you go to school at UBC?
No, I went to school at Kwantlen.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then, because you're in Vancouver now, right? Yeah. Okay. Is that where you're from, or was that?
I was born and raised in Richmond.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and living in Vancouver in the past few years, but have been in the Lower Mainland for my whole life. So.
So BC born and raised.
Exactly. Yeah.
And how did you end up going into sort of like the psychology counseling route and then into the education route sort of further?
It was by fluke. And I think it was fate because I was getting my degree in psychology because I just knew that that's the topic I was interested in, human behavior. And I was being told that you're never going to get a career and with a degree in psychology, and I wasn't willing to accept that. So I sent my resume out everywhere trying to get hired, and I got hired with an amazing nonprofit as a workshop facilitator for a job that I knew nothing about, but it was a job, so I took it. And so in that job, we were given training on sexual exploitation and human trafficking. And during that training, I became very passionate about this issue that was so underground that I hadn't heard of before and I hadn't learned about before. And then when we started doing presentations across the province to children and youth, I started to see just how prevalent it is, because we were getting disclosures from kids all over in every community, and just stories that would not have been published in the newspaper that would just blow your mind. And so I think that really sparked my interest in the issue. And I did go to work frontline for a little bit, but prevention is kind of where I get my energy from. And so I went back into prevention, and down the road, that nonprofit itself as a society closed, but its programs got absorbed by a bigger nonprofit. But my position and myself did not continue. And so I just saw that there would be a gap in services, especially with regards to adult education and addressing more of the root concerns to why this issue happens. And so I started C.
And sort of for the future listeners, could you give a quick description of like the sexual exploitation, sort of what it is, and then what you teach?
Yeah, so sexual exploitation, I mean, it's a form of human trafficking, and it's also an umbrella term. Essentially, it refers to anybody under the age of 18 who is exchanging a sexual act for anything in return. So you can exchange a sexual act for things like food, drugs, money, like when we think about prostitution, or you can exchange a sexual act for things like popularity, acceptance, safety. So when we think about cases in high school where there's pressures to sext, or you go to a party and you're not really giving consent, but there's a pressure to engage in sexual activity, that's sexual exploitation. But also on the more extreme end of things, youth and children under 18 being groomed into prostitution is actually human trafficking, and it's not prostitution. And so that's kind of the realm that I work under.
Right. And then if you were to sort of describe what your work is now in regards to that, kind of what would be?
So I do education and training in hopes to prevent the issue and also to raise awareness. And so what I do is I have youth presentations, 3 different types of youth presentations. One is just online safety and talking about exploiters online, because we tend to think of one type of predator, but there's many. And then another type of education I give is healthy relationships with regards to sexual exploitation. And that's where I address more of the consent, gender socialization, and just grooming tactics, and discussing what exploitation is so that youth can feel empowered to not go down that route. And I teach a social justice presentation as well. And then with regards to trainings, I do education for parents, teachers, nonprofit workers, frontline workers, law enforcement officers, and pretty much anybody else that's kind of in the field or would come in contact with children and youth.
Right, which covers a lot of people. So, and so for someone who is at like a forefront of a social justice issue, and I presume that comes up with a lot of other social justice issues as well, what advice would you give to someone who wants to get more involved and sort of take concrete action?
With regards to concrete action, for me, what I first think about is actually just our personal lives, because what I've noticed is that what contributes to social justice issues being perpetuated is that we dichotomize the issue from our societal or cultural norms. And so I would say if you're interested in taking concrete action, for example, with sexual exploitation, if you strongly believe in women not being exploited, for example, and you're a feminist, but at the same time, you might not think twice about watching 365 Days and thinking that's a very sexy movie. Sometimes there's a little bit of like a dichotomy between what's normal, like what's normal for us and what we don't think twice about, versus issues that actually do perpetuate that particular issue. So for example, like for me with sexual exploitation, if that's something that I'm passionate about, then concrete steps that I take is making sure that I don't promote, the whole bachelor and bachelorette parties that involve strip clubs, or that I'm cautious about not glamorizing particular movies that might glamorize sexual assault. So that's something that I would definitely say, and then just to think twice about what do we normalize in our culture. And because I think that these issues, at the end of the day, when we think about social justice issues, we think of the most extreme, but they come down to the things that become part of our culture and our norms, and that's what we need to change.
Right. Right. Yeah, like the cliche, like it starts at home is definitely like
Yeah.
very true.
Exactly.
And definitely very easy to start making those like little steps to, and like you said, like in any social justice issue, just definitely easier to do than I think people think it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a form of very strong activism, because then naturally the group of friends that you have, your social group, you tend to have those conversations with those people as well. And that's how we spread awareness.
Yeah, and all of a sudden the bubble's a bit bigger, which is always good. And so on a sort of like confidence side note, what advice would you give to a young woman or a person who is from a marginalized gender that wants to work more in the social justice or non-for-profit sector, but might be like struggling to sort of see themselves in that role? It's always, like you said, it was a risk, sort of like starting up your business. Like it is risky in the way any career is, but definitely with its other sort of tenets. But
yeah, I think just the way that we've been socialized, we understand our self-worth and we identify our self-worth from external standards versus and external measures versus intrinsic qualities, for example. But the capacity to be a leader and leadership qualities really just come from passion and drive and commitment, and not giving up, right? Which is all intrinsic qualities. And I think that something that's really important is we all get boxed in. It's just the way that the brain naturally works. We categorize people and we get boxed in. And I think it's really important to not take it personally, the concept of getting boxed in, or box yourself in an anticipation that somebody else is going to as well. Because I think that those people who've really been successful and who are leaders are ones who were boxed in and were rejected at first, and they just fought and fought and fought and didn't let themselves be limited by what somebody else might perceive them as. So I would just really emphasize that might be something that we experience, that focus on extrinsic qualities, but that at the end of the day, if you really are driven and you're passionate and you don't give up, you will get the success and impact that you're wanting to have.
Yeah, actually, I just listened to the Simon Sinek like TED talk of like find your why. Yeah, and like love that. I absolutely love his whole, as much as like as basic as that is as far as like motivational speeches. I love his like that's how you sell or get someone to like vote for you or get someone to sort of is like having that passion and that why. And I think that's such a great sort of starting point, like you said, for getting yourself out of that box and sort of pushing those limits, which definitely is more difficult to do. But and so what do you think your sort of biggest obstacle was in reaching those or surpassing those limits and sort of getting out of that box?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was my biggest obstacle, is that I get boxed in with my looks. I look young, I look feminine, I'm quite petite, and so I've noticed that the biggest obstacle for me is people not taking me seriously or not believing that I'm an expert or that I have knowledge or something worthwhile to offer, because I get stereotyped as a particular type of person because I look a particular way. And what I found is that I've been put in situations where I'm getting that judgment, but within a few minutes of just talking, I gain the respect that I should have. And so I think that's been more of the driving force for me to continue and to not be impacted by those things. And that's why I've really seen in person, if you really have that passion and drive, if somebody has 10 minutes of your time, they'll be sold on you, right? So despite the being judged. So and another part is, for me, if I'm not being taken seriously, or if I feel that way, it actually drives me even more to convince that. So, I think that's another helpful thing as well. so that's one way that I've overcome that obstacle, is just putting myself out there, especially if I feel like I'm being boxed in and I know that there's an important message that needs to be said. I just try and push my way through, and then I get that. And another thing is, quite honestly, I have a partner who's very, very supportive. And there have been moments where I've doubted myself, or I've gotten scared about taking that risk and being vulnerable. And he's really pushed me. And so I think that's leaning on support systems and people that believe in you is really key as well.
And sort of going back to getting the confidence to sort of convince someone to get against those stereotypes. Would you say that was a skill that you developed, or sort of like something that came when you found your passion, or like a personality trait, or like a little bit of all three?
That's a good question. I think that I think it's something that was innate in me, but it needed to come out just by force. Because growing up, I think I wouldn't have naturally been the type to put myself out there. I was very introverted and shy. But at the same time, I've always had a piece of me that feels like if I'm given an opportunity, I just wouldn't want to say no. And so in those moments where I felt the most uncomfortable, or I felt like I'm being judged or boxed in, and then I managed to break through, those very first few times that happened, I had a high off of that feeling. And so that's kind of what has driven me to know that I can get respect after a few minutes of somebody really getting to know me or hearing what I have to say. So, and again, that comes down to, being a leader sometimes means pushing yourself outside those insecurities. And like, to me, I one of the quotes that I love is that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's moving forward when you have that fear. And I really think that's true.
And would you say that was sort of your biggest like learning curve, or was there something else that kind of on your way up, something that happened and you had to?
I think my biggest learning curve, honestly, was learning not to take it personally if I heard a no from someone, that didn't actually mean rejection or that I didn't have something to offer. Because when I first started C, I would get a no, and it felt very personal that they're rejecting me or my capacity. But I quickly started to see that every time I received a no, I got a yes that was a 10 times better opportunity than the no. And so it took a few months of things to get running and for there to be consistency, for me to not be affected by that. But I think that was one of the biggest ones. And I think a lot of us struggle with that, is when you're doing work that's important to you, you take it personal. And so you can take, if somebody's not interested in it or they don't see the relevance of it, it's actually not a reflection of you, and to not take it personally and not be impacted by it.
And have you found that the community has been pretty receptive of C and sort of what you're offering?
I have found that I've had to be very creative in how I present C in order for the community to be open
Right.
to it. Because when you say sexual exploitation and human trafficking, people don't think that it's relevant and they don't understand it, which makes sense because I didn't think it was relevant and I didn't understand it before I learned. So what I've had to do is more so of, when I do outreach about the education, I make sure that I actually target it in a way where I'm using trendy words or concepts that, like internet safety. Everybody knows internet safety. And then when I get in, then we go more into the sexual exploitation route and they understand the link of why it was important in the first place. But I think that we still have a lot of growth and a lot of awareness that's yet to come. But I think we're on the right path. So.
And how do you think that sort of like your previous experience, either in psychology or your work before, sort of helped you to develop C and like to see that gap in what was being offered before? Because like you said, it did fill a gap that was missing.
Yeah, I think, to be honest with you, I I mean, I was very privileged in a lot of ways growing up. I'm marginalized in some ways, but I was very privileged in others. I think in terms of my unique, lived experiences, or who I am and how that contributed to C, I think it was just more thinking back to my days in high school and recognizing that there were a lot of situations with people that I knew or with friends that were sexual exploitation, that were illegal, that were not okay, but that were brushed off because that's just what you did or that was the norm. And I also started to recognize that really, like, if I was put in the position, I could have been groomed as well, just because of the way that the issue is. And so I think that's kind of shaped the way that I've created C. And another aspect of it is the work experience working with youth who were at risk or who had been exploited, and really understanding where they're coming from and how they perceive their lived experience to be, because I think that's an important piece.
Yeah, I feel like that's a very common sort of like, that would never happen to me, or like,
Yeah.
I would know if it was happening to me and like I wouldn't let it happen. And I feel like that's something that you think until it's happening.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And compared to, like, for me, when I've worked with youth who've been in that situation, I fully understand how they got there, and I can understand how I wouldn't have been somebody better at at pointing that out, especially when you're younger and you have so many vulnerabilities and insecurities. So
Yeah, oh, for sure. And then sort of, because you do work with a very complex issue and a very complex population, how have you, and C in general, applied an intersectional lens to sort of that work?
yeah, so that's a complicated question in the sense that this issue itself actually does not discriminate. It really doesn't. So that's one aspect, but the other aspect to me is language. So something that I've been very cautious about is in my presentations, talking about gender socialization, making sure not to use gendered language or language that might isolate one type of person from the issue, and making sure that it's very inclusive so that everyone who's hearing that message feels like it's relatable to them. I think that's more of how I've made sure to put that in. Of course, there's always areas of growth. But that being said, I also apply intersectionality into my trainings with law enforcement, for example, and organizations who might work with vulnerable populations. And I reach out to particular groups that might be dealing with populations like that as well. For example, foster care parents or Indigenous groups. But what I've noticed is that it really does come down to language. Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like that's definitely not necessarily the easiest, but the most like straightforward and like powerful at the same time, which is nice. But yeah, it's definitely something that I have to work on. I feel like it's.
And there's always areas of growth too. I think that, that's where it kind of helps to always have somebody else giving you input as well, because there's always room for growth and there's always blind spots for every person. So, but language is, like you said, it's very powerful in making sure that somebody doesn't feel that they're not a part of that presentation, because I've seen presentations before where there is gendered language, for example, and you can tell that, when we're talking very heavily about like females being victimized against males, and you're kind of creating that in the examples that you're giving, for example, that one gender might just like completely shut off to what they're hearing. So
Yeah, I definitely feel like your topic of work definitely has that aspect to it. So, but it's good that you are approaching that from that sort of standpoint. Yeah. And so, kind of across all of the questions, you have mentioned sort of like it was something that you always felt attached to, like giving back and working, and it was part of your culture and all of that. And so along those lines is sort of like the values that you've carried with and kind of have shaped you. And so what would you consider your values to be? I know we've kind of covered it in general, but in a more of a specific sense.
I think from the work that I've done, I've noticed that the two main values that tend to stand out for me is collaboration and inclusivity. Because I've noticed that it's been very important for me to connect with people and with groups who have different mission statements or mandates or approaches. And again, not boxing people out because they might be a little bit different than me, or they might understand the issue differently, or how it should be addressed. And so the way that I guess I put that into my work is just relying on feedback and making sure that I do try and connect with those groups that do that are different from mine, or do approach things differently from mine. And that being said, that's a huge challenge because I've noticed that there's not actually receptivity to that in the community out there. There just isn't, and it's unfortunate. And another way that I try and do that is also when I'm doing presentations to groups where I know that there might be boxing out of other agencies, I try and create a collaborative approach for them to have more empathy and working with that other group. So for example, a lot of frontline workers have a very, very, very negative view of police departments, right? If they're working with victims, they don't want to get police involved. And I empathize with that. I get it, because we've had situations where things don't go right and they're not dealt with properly. But at the same time, it's very harmful to not have a collaborative approach. And so in my trainings, if I'm training like a frontline group, I really try and create empathy with the fact that police department has a different mandate. And a part of working, bringing a client who's a victim and connecting them with the police department is you understanding what that mandate is, so you're not over-promising that victim, and talking about what the benefits really would be of connecting them with the police agencies and best practices and how to do that. So I try and kind of bring in those values of collaboration and inclusivity, and when I'm training other groups so that they feel more comfortable connecting with other agencies, and I myself try and make those connections as well. But it is a challenge. I think it's just natural for us to, you feel passionate about something, and then if you see someone not conducting themselves in the manner that you think is best, then you might want to, box them out or think they're wrong for doing that. And there's kind of that culture right now of really being outspoken and like canceling people out, which is helpful with some issues, but I think so, it's not collaborative. And so that's kind of what I focus on, and I think what's important to me in my work.
Yeah, and your work definitely covers all fields, all genders, all ages. It's not, you definitely have a complex, interconnected network. And it is impressive of all the different sort of things that you have to take into account when you are presenting this education to that many different groups and with that many different sort of associations with the topic. And so how do you avoid kind of becoming overwhelmed by not only just the complexity of the issue, but the vast amount of work that still has to be done?
Yeah, I think that for me has happened when I go more into a global lens. And I think about like addressing the issue as a whole. I definitely feel overwhelmed. And I've noticed that when I focus back on the small wins, that's where I feel more empowered. For me, it does feel defeating, and it feels disempowering when I go global. That's just the way that I personally function. I think a lot of us do. That's when we start to get even more riled up and angry and trying to go out there and fight every fight. But it really is the small wins that make a difference and make a change. And I watched a TED Talk one time. It's called Lollipop Moments, if you ever wanted to look it up. But it talks about the fact that there's a lot of impact that we have in our lives on people that we never end up hearing about. So just the reminder that there's someone out there that's been impacted by you, and you don't know it. And the other thing is, like, for me to focus on stories where I know that I've actually changed a life unknowingly. So, I mean, for example, I've just naturally talked about this issue with my sister, not thinking much about it. But a few years down the road, she actually came across a victim who was being human trafficked. And because we had that discussion, she was able to spot it out. And long story short, we ended up saving that girl who was being human trafficked.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was an insane story.
Yeah.
It was straight out of a movie, an insane story. But it really put that, put into perspective. Well, if I hadn't had that casual discussion with her, she wouldn't have been able to spot those signs. And I would have thought, and then I thought, well, how many other people heard that message and were able to put in practice, what was passionate for me. So I think, it's important to think global, but also recognizing that it really is those small ones. That's how we make that difference, is within our communities. And and another aspect of that, I think, is also humility is required. So not having, I think it helps to know that you won't be responsible for the whole world changing. You can have a huge impact, but for me, I can't change the whole issue by myself, and recognizing that, and then leaning on others and other agencies that do the work that I can't do, for example, is feels more empowering than feeling the weight of everything on my own shoulders.
Yeah, kind of back to the collaboration side of things, and
yeah, exactly,
having a good support system, and it kind of all ties together, like starting small, working your way out.
Yeah.
Which I definitely think is important to keep in mind, because it's any social justice issue. When you look at the global scale, like you said, it's worth, you have to look at it on a grand scale, but that's when it does become a bit more out of reach.
Yeah.
And on our one question that we're asking is like interest more than anything else, is how do you think that the pandemic has affected women in leadership roles, but also like women just in general?
I think I heard a stat on the news that 70% of the people that lost their jobs in March due to the pandemic in Canada were women. So I think there's unfortunately a lot of alarming statistics out there that women have unfortunately gotten the shorter end of the stick with the pandemic. That being said, with regards to women in leadership, I think it's made things more challenging, and I'm kind of thinking from the place that I come from, but I think that a lot of women in leadership who have families and had to balance work-life balance as it is, have been placed in a more difficult position, because now a lot of them have had to work from home, and they're with their kids full time while also trying to run a company or be a manager of some sort. So I think it's definitely been challenging. I also think that hopefully in the future there's some benefits to it, just to know that a lot of work can be done from home. So women, if they're having struggles or challenges in their personal life and need to tend to that, then maybe there might be more flexibility and understanding that they can get that work done at home if they need to.
Yeah, fingers crossed that a little bit more like empathy comes out of all of this. Because I do feel like that is kind of coming up a bit more of people being like, oh wow, women do so many things, they take care of kids and run jobs, and it's like that's kind of always been obviously the norm. And so hopefully it kind of continues on this appreciation for the power that a woman is, and obviously any parent who takes on that's role, the main caregiving role, but it is usually the woman. So hopefully that is a permanent
ability.
Yeah. And so we've been asking that just because obviously everyone's talking about the pandemic, so had to feature it.
Talk about it.
Yeah, we tried to make all the other questions without it being the topic of conversation, but felt wrong to leave it out. And so our last two that are more of about you personally, with or without your work, where do you find your inspiration?
I think there's two avenues for me. I think one is that when I see injustice, because I'm someone who's driven by justice, when I see injustice, that inspires me to push more. And the other aspect that I found more recently to be an impact for me is when I get requests from people to help. I've gotten a lot of emails from people wanting to volunteer for me, who want to work for me. And I think it's just that encouraging yeah, it's that encouraging piece for me to see that other people are passionate to do the work that I'm doing as well, as kind of where I get my inspiration from.
Yeah, that it's not just you out on
Yeah,
an island. It's definitely there's
exactly.
other people. Which is the team? Is it just you, or is there a group? Or
Yeah, so it's been me, and right now I have two amazing volunteers who are doing their masters in very specialized areas connecting to the issue, and they're helping me out, and I hope to expand the team for sure moving down the road.
yeah, that's one that leads into our next question. Sort of, what are your next steps in your work, in C, in your general life?
Well, I'm currently 7 months pregnant.
Oh, congrats.
Yeah, thank you. So in the next couple of months, I will be going on a maternity leave and focusing just solely on my newborn. But after that, I definitely do. We're right now with the volunteers actually expanding the programs. So we're creating a gender-based violence presentation and education, and also elementary school as well. So I see the programs expanding, and I'm also looking into and hoping to start hiring employees and grow the team. So that's the goal.
Yeah, back to sexual exploitation being a very widespread issue.
Yes.
There are a lot of avenues that you can head down. So yeah, expansion obviously seems kind of like the logical next step. There's so many other sort of roads to go down. But
yeah, and I think it takes a while too to like for me, it took a little bit of time to understand how I would have employees come on board and how everything would function and what things would look like. So I'm quite confident that once maternity leave is done, I'd be able to bring on the people who want to work for me. So
yeah, well, that's really exciting. And yet again, congrats. I had no idea. So that'll be
looks smaller than here down.
Yeah. Yeah, Zoom kind of can leave those details out. But yeah, I really, really appreciate that you took the time to talk with us, or talk to me, and then us as an elector. We really appreciate all of that and the knowledge and the advice that you brought. Hopefully we will pass on to some of the younger generation and people who do kind of want to go down the social justice route, however that sort of takes form for them. You definitely have a very interesting job, start a very interesting career, and the work you do is very interesting. So I think it will be also interesting to see where it goes. So I'm excited.
Thank you for including me in this. I think again that the group is really great and much needed. So yeah, and if anybody ever has questions or anything, feel free to reach out to me.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I hope you have a good rest of your day. And I will let you know when we get this up.
Awesome.
So thank you again. Bye.
Bye.